Welcome everybody to this our third session of the RENEW18 Open Research Seminar. I'm Marco Storni. I'm a postdoc in the context of the RENEW18 research endeavor. And this Open Research Seminar, which I co-organized with Casper De Witt and Olivier Claude, is meant to read and discuss together some recent perspectives on early modern science and philosophy, and particularly Newton and his legacy. And today we have the pleasure of having with us Clémence Sadaillan, who is the author of a recently published monograph, which I have here in my hands, Espace, physique et théologie chez Newton, published by Classiques Garnier in 2023. Clémence teaches philosophy in high school in France. She got her PhD in philosophy in 2022 from the University of Lille. And this book draws on her PhD dissertation. And right now, as she was explaining to us before the meeting started, she's working on two main areas. On the one hand, the question of space in the Newtonian texts. And also, more recently, she got interested in the relationship between the way we experience space and the way in which we characterize the idea of space. So, sort of non-phenomenological approach, as she said, but in between the experience of space and the categorization and conceptualization of space. So today the meeting will be organized as usual. So Clémence will have the opportunity to present her research, her book, in a few minutes. So you might take your time actually in 15, 20 minutes or how much you want. And then we will move on to discussion, which will be open and to everybody to join. So please, Clémence, the floor is yours. And thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to you, Marco and Casper, for inviting me to this seminar, to join you at this seminar, and for your technical adaptation. As Marco said, I am a teacher and I am in the south of France, and I cannot move around freely when and where I want to. So thank you, and thanks the technology to meet you. For a start, I don't want to look narcissistic, but I would like to explain to you what is my background, my influences, and why I chose to study Newton, because I think all of this explain this book, Espace, physique et théologie chez Newton. The book has the same name of my thesis, but it is a revised version with a lot of modification and less of footnotes. I have a philosophical background, and I am truly interested in the intellectual mechanisms, in the way the knowledge advances, in the way the knowledge is built. I am not a very specialist of epistemology in a strong sense, in a sense where my knowledge in science and in technology isn't very strong. I am more interested in how we think, how we believe, how we prove our assumptions, how we do hypotheses, and why. It seems to me that this interest in intellectual mechanisms can be seen in this book, because I try to analyze in detail each of Newton's texts I have selected, and I wonder how did Newton think in this text? With what thoughts or philosophy did he construct his own thinking, and what did he want to achieve? In 2018, I started to study his work, under the supervision of Edouard Mel. Maybe you know his work, I don't know. He's mainly known for his studies about Descartes. And I started my research. It's funny for me now to think about it, but I started my research with a total naive state of mind. I didn't know there were so many Newtonian studies. I didn't know about Dobbs, about Westphal, about etc. I didn't know all of these names, and I believe it is exactly why I started this thesis, because I wasn't intimidated because I didn't know all of that. Before meeting Newton, a number of intellectual figures marked the beginning of my thinking. And I would like to introduce a few of them to you briefly to understand after the echoes they had in my research about Newton. Years ago, I had met Alexander Koyré, of course from the close world to the infinite universe, but also with a selection of conferences and articles about philosophy of science. From him, I learned to look at the history of philosophy as something that is not closed on itself. The history of philosophy can be understood within the history of ideas. Philosophers are people, we know that too, I think, people who are not locked in an ivory tower or in the sky of ideas. Of course, someone can be alone, and of course, Newton wasn't known for his social life, but I am not talking about social life or political life or friendships. I am talking about influences of an age, about the Zeitgeist in German, the intellectual atmosphere, or in French, l'air du temps. And I believe we could find some lines of force that cross the ages and disappear, or open potential new lines of force. And I learned that from Koyré and from his effort to question the past, to find these lines, and to not stay prisoner of certain conception of this or that age. And after meeting Koyré, I had met Descartes, and it is important for De Gravitatione, we will talk about that later. But when I read Descartes, I discovered that my conception of his philosophy wasn't exact, because I hadn't read all his work. So I did it, and my conception isn't still exact. There are a lot of discussion about him even today, but this long reading has broadened my vision of his philosophy. I saw his philosophy change a lot over the years, even if he says, of course, I always thought like that. It's not true. It changed. And from Descartes and from this reading, I learned to look at the details of a philosophy before the system, and the details inside a temporal line. Elsewhere, I was very impressed by the work of Gérard Simon. Maybe you know him. He studied Kepler. He mainly studied Kepler, and his work, I think so, is luminous. Gérard Simon tells us the thinkers, scientists, philosophers, theologians, artists build their thinking A thinking is a construction and it takes time to build it. Of course, it is a very simple idea, but at the same time, we like beautiful systems, clear, finished, consistent from the start to the end. Gérard Simon takes time to read this evolution step by step when he meets a philosophy. And I decided to follow this important principle concerning Newton. I tried to follow his way and to apply his method to Newtonian thinking about space. It is why my book and my thesis at the beginning is like a long explanation or an archaeology of the Newton's text. It means identifying the sources of his ideas and of the ideas of his opponents. Before meeting Newton, I was thinking about two questions. First, I was and I still am interested in the link between natural philosophy and metaphysics or first philosophy, especially in the 17th century. Maybe you noticed that in the introduction of the book. I won't go into that now, but we can discuss it later if you wish. Then I am wondering still, what is space? From this question about the nature of space, I wonder why we like to think or to imagine space as it were a thing. Whereas science claims it doesn't exist like a thing, independent from time and from forces and from bodies. It is the point I will precise now about Newton. Excuse me. About space, Newton faces two problems. He tries to determine the nature of space. What is it? What are its functions? Its characteristics? Is it something? In what sense? Is it a substance? Is it a characteristic of or property of bodies, of God? What is its space? What's its nature? At the same time, it is not very to analyze it, but I think it is a very important question for him. He wonders how space could exist. He tries to determine its mode of causation. How space can exist? Is it created? Is it a consequence of something else? For instance, let's say that space is a creation, but if it's the case, where was God? Where was God before creating space? Let's say space is an emanation, like he said in De Gravitatione. But if it's the case, space could be a part of God, and it would be a theological difficulty for him. So what's the nature of space and how space could exist? After the introduction you read, and after a chapter named L'unité et l'ancestralité du savoir, about the Prisca Theologia, we enter in the first Newtonian text I analyze, namely De Gravitatione. We could discuss this, but I think it is an early manuscript. Maybe you remember my arguments about that, about its datation. De Gravitatione shows us Newton discussing with Aristotle and his concept of topos, and with mainly Descartes in a very Henri Morse way. I just will insist on some points and questions I still have today about this manuscript, and I would be grateful if you had some answers or hypotheses about them to share with me. We notice right from the start, when Newton talks about the first definition of the manuscript, that he moves away from Aristotle. Of course, he writes the locus is full of body, but a locus is just a part of space. It's as if he faces a problem of words and at the same time a problem of ideas. Is space something else than a set of loci, a set of topoi, or a set of places? What is the link between these two words, place and space, and another word, extension? Place, he writes, is a portion of space occupied by body. Space isn't necessarily occupied by body. Therefore, space can be empty. What is clear from this assertion, it is the distance he takes from Descartes about the vacuum and about the ontology of space in general. Like Henri Morse, Newton refuses to make extension the exclusive characteristic of bodies. Why? Because, like Henri Morse, Newton refuses the Cartesian dualism. Why? If we remember the discussion between Morse and Descartes, Morse thinks there is no reason, no necessity to conclude that space exists just as an extension of bodies. Why Descartes claims this link between extension and bodies? It is because he refuses the existence of the vacuum, of the emptiness. There is no emptiness, no void, just bodies moving around, pushing each other's. In this perspective, Descartes is close to Aristotle. The body needs extension to exist, but there is no need to admit that a space, especially an empty space, exists. The other reason is that Descartes doesn't want to place immaterial things somewhere. This choice is a problem. Elizabeth, the Princess Elizabeth, shows it very clearly to Descartes, because if immaterial things are nowhere, therefore it is difficult to understand the link between a body and a soul. It is the famous difficulty about the connection between body and soul in Descartes' philosophy. But for Newton, the problem isn't really the place of souls. It is the location of God. Where is God if God isn't nowhere? Is it really there? Newton, you know that, is very religious, and it is very important for him in his life, in his work. Therefore, it is not a small question. It is a fundamental one. Like Henri Morse, he wants God to occupy a space, to be really somewhere, namely everywhere, for scientific reasons, but most importantly, for theological reasons. He refuses to reduce space to the mere extension of bodies. There is a space in which bodies can move, and where God can exist and can act on the creation. I said Newton had a Morean way to reject Descartes. But let's be careful, Newton isn't Henri Morse, especially he disagrees with the deification of space. We can find this refusing of deification of space in some, we can find, the deification of space in some text of Henri More, like the Enchiridion Metaphysicum, but it is a constant in the Newtonian thinking about space. Space isn't God, and space isn't part of God. Not all the statements of the De Gravitatione will be kept in the future text of Newton. For instance, he will abandon the terminology of emanation, and he will be more cautious about the uncreated nature of space. But we find the roots of problem and of some ideas he will keep in the future in De Gravitatione, and among these ideas we find this separation, distinction between God and space. However, reading De Gravitatione, we meet a problem, and it is the point about I would like to have your opinion. I am not sure, maybe you noticed my dubs in the book, but I am not sure that I understand very well the link between an intellectual space and a space that would exist outside our minds. Maybe you will clarify this point for me. I hope so. I have the impression that maybe it's not very clear for Newton himself, or it is like he agrees with a sort of geometrical or mathematical realism, but without saying it. He talks about space outside of our mind, but the same could be said about mental space. It is as if he puts a bridge between a mental or mathematical level and a physical level. And we can see that in his demonstration of the infinity of space. The demonstration is a geometrical one, whereas he's speaking about physical space. I will conclude about this problem in De Gravitatione and in general still today. We are accustomed to thinking in terms of space and of Newtonian absolute space, namely the absolute space we find in the definitions of the Principia. This idea of space means a space different from bodies, and it looks like a container, a sort of Platonic cora, but without matter, a sort of vase or a bowl. This bowl can be full or empty of matter. This space looks like the one we have in mind, in which we imagine or trace lines, figures, or maybe dragons and imaginary words. Therefore, we can ask ourselves this question. We have one word, space, but does this word have only one meaning? The space in which there is matter or not, is it the same that the space we have in mind? It is the same thing, and are they a thing? Does this representation of space, the space ball, we could say, does it correspond to anything real? And why do we have this way of thinking space, of thinking about space? The Newtonian way of thinking space is our legacy. It appears as a simple idea, out of nowhere, eternal and unquestionable. But when we look closer, apart the Epicurean vacuum, it is a recent idea. This idea response to scientific and theological challenges of the 17th century. But now we don't need it anymore. In science and physics proves that we cannot think space without time and movements and bodies. But we keep it in our ordinary language because it is a way, not the way, but one historical way of understanding our environment, our movements, and our own body meeting other bodies. To really conclude, I wanted to tell you that I am truly honored to discuss about Newton and about this work with you today. But I am also very uncomfortable in English and you know the French. And I don't often, almost never, speak English, speak philosophy in English. So I will do my best and let's talk maybe, let's speak slowly if you want to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clémence.
Thank you.
The clapping was muted, but was clear to our eyes. As I think it was really interesting to hear about your path and how you developed your interest in philosophy. I particularly liked the triad you mentioned, Quéré, Descartes, Gérard Simon, with Descartes in between. So it was curious, and I think you touched upon some of the topics which we'll discuss today. So the relationship between theology and scientific concerns, whether space is a thing, and what's the relationship between the space as scientists conceptualize it vis-a-vis the space of theologians or metaphysicians and so on. So I think we can open the floor for discussion, and to break the ice right before Leone asks his question, I will perhaps immediately use the privilege of chairing the session to ask a question and then leave the floor for anybody else to ask something. And my question concerns something that you have also mentioned in this presentation, but which is discussed at the beginning of the introduction of the book, and it's the notion of espace imaginaire, imaginary space. And at page, in the document we read, the end of page 4, beginning of page 5, and your book is page 14, you discuss the disparition, the death of this conception of imaginary space, which seems to coincide chronologically with the rise of the so-called scientific revolution. So the very moment when Galileo, Newton, and Descartes and the others started to do a new science, then this conception of imaginary space, which you link to Thomas Aquinas, disappeared. And my question, which is more of a curiosity, but maybe you can tell us more about this point, is whether this passage is really that abrupt, or whether it is more gradual and there is a coexistence between these two conceptions of space, and whether there are the critiques against the imaginary space as Aquinas formulates it came from Newton or from other scientists, or I mean, which are the sources of this critique of imaginary space?
Thank you for your question. Maybe you want me to begin to remind what is an imaginary space. I don't know if you want me to explain that. The notion of imaginary spaces is an ambivalent one, and right from the start, it answers to it answers the theological problem of the presence of God, as I mentioned in my talk. Scholastic theologians need this notion to think this idea, to think a presence of God, but not an immanent presence of God. God has to be here, but not in this or that place, and not in general in the created world. So they imagine a space that is potential, that is a potential space. This nature of these imaginary spaces means that they are not, maybe not exactly fictive and not real either. If you are interested about this, you find a chapter in a book of Edward Grant, which is very clear. It is in Planets, Stars and Orbs. I don't remember the number of the chapter, but Edward Grant has written about this question of the nature of imaginary spaces and of the different theses about this ambivalent nature. And he notes that there were two main ways of thinking this idea in the 16th century. There are those who refuse the idea of an extra-cosmic void. For these thinkers, imaginary spaces are strictly fictive. They are what we could say the rational beings, des êtres de fiction in French. And there are those who begin to think that when an imaginary space is full of body, it becomes something real, as a real place, then imaginary again when it is empty. And it could receive bodies, but being not exactly real. They think about it as a potential or a virtual space or extension. In the 17th century, Gassendi, Gassendus, I think in English, Gassendi takes up this notion again, but he modifies it. And he begins to attribute to this notion, to this idea, a sort of mathematical reality. When the space is occupied by body, it gains a sort of physical dimension. So it could have both physical and mathematical reality. About the posterity of the posterity, is it okay in English? The legacy?
Posterity or legacy, both.
Okay, thank you. Of this word and of this idea. In Newton's text, I think we find this idea in De Gravitatione and in other manuscripts of Newton, Tempus and Locus. In the book, I talk about that in the chapter about Tempus et Locus. Therefore, I have the feeling that this idea has known two destinies. If you take this idea in the strong sense of imaginary, this idea is disappearing in the 17th century because we don't need it anymore. But the interpretation of imaginary spaces as potential or mathematical potential spaces has a posterity. In Newton, in Gassendi before, and in the Newtonian after Newton. I don't know if I'm clear.
Yes, I was very clear.
Okay, and I have something else maybe to add. Maybe you read it in the book. In a footnote, I make a reference to Kant. I am not a good reader of Kant, but when I did this research about imaginary, I will say it in Latin, so about imaginary spaces, Edouard Mel, my supervisor, who knows very well Kant, advised me to read again the analysis of principles of the critique of the pure reason, donc l'analytique des principes, de la critique de la raison pure. And reading this text, I suggested a parallel between this old idea of imaginary spaces and the idea of ens imaginarium of Kant. But I'm not absolutely, maybe I look sure of myself in this footnote, but I am not. And I'm not sure about this parallel. But maybe it is a sort of posterity of this old idea in philosophy of Kant.
And I guess there are a lot of Kantians in the room with whom you might want to discuss. But thank you very much for the answer to my question. Then Leone, you have a question, I guess.
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation and for sharing the introduction. I had a question out of curiosity because I'm very interested in the topic of analogy and very interested in Newton's employment of analogies. And here you have some remarks about what you're doing in your book with the sensorium Dei analogy. And I just wanted to ask if you can say something more about that. If you can say something more about the difference between the two functions of analogy you're referring to in the introduction. And maybe this has something to do, I guess, or this is the way I've always understood the sensorium Dei analogy. Maybe this has something to deal with what you were pointing at in your remarks at the beginning of the meeting about Newton refusing Henry More's idea that that God and space are one and the same entity. If these two functions of analogy you're mentioning in the introduction somehow have something to deal with the rejection of Henry More's claim. Thank you.
Thanks to you for this difficult question. In the chapter about the general scholium of the Principia. I'm trying to understand in what sense Newton uses analogy, and I try to distinguish two ways of using this logical relationship. I have the impression, the feeling that Newton tries to say something, but is prisoner from the limits of his language and of the ontological and logical categories of his time. And we are everyone is a prisoner of the categories of his time, of course, but and I have the impression that when you take all the Newtonian texts about space and you follow the evolution of its thinking, it tries some strategies to think and to express the nature and the causation of space and its relationship with God. In need to claim a strong relation between God and space, because in need to put God somewhere and to give him the possibility to act in the creation, but at the same time it doesn't want to mix the two in one entity. And I have the impression that his use of analogy is one of these strategies to try to express something like a strong relationship without confusion of the two entities. And I have established, but maybe it is false, and we could discuss it. But I have the impression that he takes analogy in a not in a very strong sense, but as something he picks up, and maybe it's a good strategy to say this link. I'm not sure I'm clear or I answer your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to you.
Other questions or comments? Ovidio.
Yeah, thanks. I hope you all can hear me well. Right.
Yes.
So yeah. So thank you very much, Clémence. I kind of have a question about your framing of the introduction. So kind of my impression was that you're framing the story about Newton's concept of space and kind of its history by making this big opposition between Newton on the one hand and Descartes, right? So the dialectics of it is kind of like, Newton has a novel kind of concept of space, which of course has some precedences, but in principle it's novel. And it's basically a reaction to, or a response to, or whatever, to Descartes' own view on space, right? Which takes space to be, of course, the essence of matter and so on. I wonder, how do you see this? I mean, I wonder about the degree in which you see Newton's concept of space to be in a clear opposition with Descartes. Because on the in another way, as it were, you could also see them both as being part of the same history, right? So from the history between, say, medieval discussions about imaginary space, then to Descartes really making it a physical thing in one way or another, and then to Newton to actually impose on it a certain kind of ontology, right? A certain kind of being, and then being able to do technical natural philosophy, presupposing an absolute space. So I wonder, how do you see the relationship between Descartes and Newton? Is it an opposition, or could we think of it in a very like continuistic, as it were, fashion?
Thank you for your question. I believe it is a real opposition between Descartes and Newton. I think Newton cannot. I think Newton discovered Descartes through Henry More, maybe Cudworth, and the thinkers of Cambridge of his time, and these thinkers have had an ambivalent relation to Descartes, because especially Henry More, Descartes was for Henry More a sort of great intellectual figures, and Henry More was Cartesian at the beginning, but he broke with Descartes, and especially about maybe the progress of science at his time, and about the existence of vacuum or emptiness. And it is a surprise when we read Descartes that Descartes refuses this idea of emptiness, whereas all the thinkers of his time are experiencing and thinking about it. And when I read the De Gravitatione, I see that Newton disagrees with Descartes for theological reasons. Of course, this is an Henry More's legacy, but also with scientific reasons. You have you need space to think translations of bodies. But in the Cartesian system, bodies just push each other's, and it results. The result of this conception is a difficulty for physics for Newton. So there are two reasons for this breaking from Descartes, and I have the impression that maybe you have another reading of Newton, but I have the impression that the opposition to Descartes is like a line of force in the thinking of Newton, even if after De Gravitatione he doesn't talk about a lot about Descartes. I have this impression, but maybe it's a more general problem. The problem when we glare at the history of philosophy, we have two tendencies to find some continuities or some discontinuities, and of course Newton is a Cartesian reader, but at the same time an opponent. But maybe, I don't know, what do you think about it, about this relation? You?
So, I mean, there's definitely reasons why you would think that the reason why Newton started to do natural philosophy was basically a reaction to Descartes, right? No, my question or my problem is really I can never tell. So suppose there was this opposition between Descartes, especially his view on space, and Newton's view of what space is, and so on. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on, like, where was the game kind of being played? So was it more important for Newton? Was the theological aspect more important of absolute space, let's say, acquired via Henry Moore or others, right? Or was the opposition really being tackled at the level of natural philosophy, at the level of what motion is, at the level of the true way of defining motion, which then, of course, could turn into more technical, natural philosophical topics. So I wonder about what came first, kind of. The issue with a theological understanding of space, or the issue with the more natural philosophical understanding?
It's the big question. I agree with you about that this opposition to Descartes marked the beginning of his work in natural philosophy on a physical, on a scientific level. But I think the theologian reasons are very, very strong in the thinking of Newton, and they are not the same, and they are not. It is not a reason to forget the scientific reasons, of course, but when we read his religious texts, his readings about religions, I think it is a constant from the start of his studies to the end of his work. And it is when I read for the first time the General Scholium, it struck me that in this wonderful book about natural philosophy, you have this heart of theologian reasons, and it's truly connected to science. Theology is connected to natural philosophy, and I'm not sure Newton wonders. I am a metaphysician or a scientist. I think this question has no signification for him, because in the 17th century there is no true distinction between the scientific level and the theologian or metaphysics level. But I understand it is a little bit disappointed for us, because we love to break the bridge between these areas.
So please, Karin, go ahead.
Yes, unless you want to go first, Henny, because you're also a space specialist. So you have your hand up. Shall I go first, or would you like to go first?
I think you can go first, Karin.
Okay.
Yeah, Henny, you're still muted.
Okay. Yes. So thanks, Clémence. I think it's a very interesting projects. And what I liked in particular from your presentation earlier on is how you distinguish between the details of a philosophy as they develop on the one hand, and on the other hand, the system. Yes, whereas researchers tend to focus on the system and not so much on the preconditions or the explorations of the philosopher or the scientist that ultimately result in a more or less coherent system. And that approach reminded me also of Hélène Metzger. So I don't know if you have read her work on the history of chemistry. I think that's very interesting and very much aligned with your methodology, Hélène Metzger. So I have a couple of questions, including at least one Kant question, but I'm going to postpone that one. And I wanted to ask you something that is related to the imaginary space and the way you presented in your introduction, because you explain how within the 16th and 17th century, the imaginary space was used as a conceptual tool. And then you go on to clarify Newton's conception of absolute space in light of the steps that had been taken by earlier theologians for different reasons. Yes, and they came up with this notion of imaginary space. And then you explain how Newton had to try to answer a number of very complicated questions concerning his own conception of absolute space, whether it is a substance, whether it is cause, and so on. And I was wondering if Newton would somehow accept that the notion of space that he needs for his scientific purposes has something, or is something like a hypothesis. Yes, of course we know that Newton was opposed to the use of hypotheses, but hypothesis in the sense of a conceptual tool that we somehow need to project or posit in order to be able to carry out a number of very well defined tasks. And so if we would think of Newton's use of the concept of absolute space as similar to a conceptual tool or even a hypothesis, then we could also see that some questions that he actually addresses are maybe not very relevant to address. Yeah, because he needs a tool that works and that serves his purposes. So that would be a very, let's say, pragmatic approach that probably doesn't do justice to Newton's metaphysical and theological concerns. But well, maybe the question is a bit too complicated. Yes, but I was struck by your point that the imaginary space, yes, that is a precursor to Newton's conception of space, was considered a conceptual tool. Yes, so these are maybe a bunch of reflections.
Thanks. To be honest, I'm not sure I understand very well your question. Do you do a distinction between a conceptual tool and an hypothesis?
No, I put them more or less together. Yes, okay. But we could also leave out the term hypothesis and focus on the notion of a conceptual tool. Yes, so so given this let's say continuity between the notion of imaginary space and Newton's conception of absolute space, would you attribute to Newton as well the use of his concept of space as a conceptual tool? And do you think that Newton would agree with this?
I think so. I think so. Mm. The idea of a conceptual tool is, as I talked about previously, about the strategy to try to think something else, to not stay prisoner from the limits of the thinking of an age. And when we read Newton, and the notes he put down with his readings, we saw that he was a very good reader, and he read a lot about theology and about science and about philosophy and about and Patrizzi and Gassendi and Cudworth. Okay. So like the thinkers of Cambridge at his time, he has a tendency to syncretism. I don't know, it's the true word, the syncretism, and to mix a lot of ideas and to put this idea and out of the contextualization of the philosophy in which they were. So maybe it's my reading and it's false, but it's wrong. But it's like a sort of building, as if you build a chair and he took tools from this philosophy or from that theologian thinker, and he tried to see if it works. That's how I see his way of thinking, but maybe it's not true. Maybe I have an interpretation that is the result of my readings of Coiré, of Gérard Simon, and maybe it is an orientation of reading that is wrong. But I think we do philosophy with concept, and concepts are, as Deleuze said it, are tools. Tools we use to build something, and tools we modify. They are at the same time. They are the tool and the object we modify with other tools. And concepts or conceptions or conceptual thinking are like pieces of a puzzle, the game, pieces of a puzzle of a game, and they push each other, they modify each other. They, if we combine them, we see another figure. And when I read Newton in the evolution of his thinking, I have precisely this vision of his mode of working.
Very nice. Marco, can I do a very small follow-up question?
Yes, sure.
Yes. But then my question remains, would you also attribute this view about the role of conceptual schemes somehow to Newton? Yes, but because I think it doesn't go very well with Newton's attempts to answer the question whether space is a substance, whether it is caused by something else. All these, very heavy metaphysical questions that do not seem to be relevant if he were to assume space simply as one of his tools. You see what I mean?
Yes, I understand. I have to think about it. Do you have in mind that if it's just a conceptual tool, it is not a real thing for him?
Well, so in that case, the very question whether space is a real thing or isn't would probably be irrelevant. Yes, as long as it does allow him to answer the questions he needs to answer and to do the measurements he needs to do and so on, then the question whether that which allows him to do the measurements is a real thing or not would be irrelevant. And if the question was not irrelevant to him, then maybe he was in two minds on the status of his own conception of space. But of course, I do not know whether this makes sense.
Yes, but I don't know what to think about it. It is difficult to distinguish the intellectual approach of Newton that Newton has to his concept of space and the quasi-affective approach we have to space, and the Newtonian in the 18th century has had to space. It was like this. It was like this idea takes a sort of density after Newton's death and became an intuitive or natural one, whereas it was a building and it was maybe just a tool to think the link between God and the world. So it is difficult for me to answer to you because I'm not sure I make this separation in my own mind between the way Newton thinks space and the way this conception of space is becoming so important in the history of ideas and in the way we experience space.
Yes, and so I think that's very relevant to our project on responses to Newton. Yes, so a certain question that is addressed by Newton and asked in a certain way, and then the way in which the concept takes on a life of its own, and sometimes makes it difficult to distinguish the reception from the original questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. I also follow up, but I leave to Henny the floor before any other question of mine.
Well, perhaps if it's a follow-up, you have, because mine is not. So then perhaps it's better to ask first.
Okay. Rather than a question, is more of a. So since we read just a part of your book, which is about an early phase of Newton's discussion of space, the Gravitazione, so this kind of early manuscripts where he starts to reflect on the concept of space, criticizing Descartes and so on. And perhaps, I'm not sure about that, but the idea of absolute space, as I've always learned it from the Principia, as say many handbooks of the history of science, and even in the 18th century sources, you see that. So absolute space is a framework. is a sort of conceptual tool, as Karin was saying, something that helps us calculate or helps us doing the math, so conceptualize our mechanics. But the metaphysical discussion is, in a certain sense, ancillary, secondary, not very important, because what matters is the function of absolute space in our mechanics. And but the Newton you presented to us, at least in that first chapter, is a more metaphysical Newton, a Newton more concerned, perhaps more concerned with theological and metaphysical grounding of space, rather than with space as a tool to do mechanics. And so the question is whether there is a chronological development in Newton's own work. So I can imagine it first more metaphysical, and in a later phase, and in the Principia especially, less metaphysical, at least with like concerning the use of space or the notion of space, and or whether this distinction comes after Newton. I don't know, from Laplace or whoever else, in the 18th century developed Newtonian mechanics. Then, I mean, in the 18th century, you tended to separate more and more space as a conceptual tool for mechanics from space as the theological and metaphysical concept. So where and if you locate this separation, whether in Newton's thought or after, or if there is not this separation at all, I mean, according to you. But,
thank you. It's a big question of in the history of philosophy, and especially in the history of metaphysics. And it's the inherent problem of metaphysics too, because when you gave me your question, I was thinking about the difficulty to define metaphysics, and this problem to give a definition of metaphysics is linked to the difficulty to understand where the metaphysics and the science or the ideas without metaphysics is. I'm trying to put my idea in a good in a good structure. Sorry, I'm thinking in two languages, and it's a very bad idea.
But also, it might be even a sort of question, like for further discussion, or which you can think about, and then we can discuss later. There is no problem.
No. It's an interesting one, but I have no real answer, because I'm not sure. I'm thinking about Descartes, to be honest, and about his separation between his metaphysics and the theology. And Descartes said very clearly that he didn't want to go into theology. It is the work of theologians, and you know all the story about that. And but so the metaphysics of Descartes was without theology, but with God, a philosopher's God, as we would say. But what's a philosopher's God? I'm not sure about this expression, what it means. Is it an entity? Thanks. I'm not sure about this expression. I'm maybe suspicious about it. But when Descartes said that he doesn't tell about theology, he put a bridge between science and metaphysics, excluding theology. But it is not simple like that, and he says that it is simple. I do not do theology, but in fact it is very complicated, because metaphysics, when you put God into this boil, metaphysics is linked to theology at the 17th century. So it is a sort of rhetoric strategy, but in fact it is very complicated, and we saw that we see that when we read the correspondence with Mersenne, for instance, where God is everywhere, and eternal truth, and so on. I think that Newton isn't careful as Descartes was, because theology and metaphysics for him are very clearly bounded. And I tried in my work to determine what are the main metaphysical theses of Newton through in the evolution of his thinking. And I made a list. If you want, I can give you this list. Okay.
Yes, and this is kind of an answer to,
okay.
I mean, my concern that
okay.
there is development.
I determined 8 theses, metaphysical theses in Newton's thinking. First, I put this on my paper, there are 3 main categories of being: the substances, the attributes of substances, and the affections common to all things, namely space and time. 2, God exists and is a substance, but not the substance, but one of the substances Newton talked about. I don't know what are the other substances, but he uses the plurial with this word at each time. 3 substances are unknowable to the human mind. 4, the divine substance can only be approached, not known, but approached by studying its attributes and sensible effects. So it's the famous link between metaphysics and theology and natural philosophy. We can see in the optics, in the general scholium, etc. 5, God created the world ex nihilo. 6, this world or the universe is infinite. 7, an empty space existed before bodies were created. And we meet here the problem of causation of space and of the moment of the apparition of space. And 8, the extension is not an essential and exclusive property or attribute of bodies. It also concerns spirits. So we don't have a metaphysical system, I think, in the Newton text. It is not a very, very clear and consistent and explicit system of metaphysics. And it's a bit disappointed when we read Newton with this purpose, but we have this thesis of metaphysics. And I think that even after Newton, when Laplace and all these thinkers distinguished metaphysics and or first philosophy and natural philosophy or physics, I think they keep metaphysical theses in their background, and I think you cannot make science without some metaphysical assumptions, even if they are unconscious, even if they are limited or very simple. You have to claim some metaphysical thesis, even if it's not a metaphysical system. And Newton was very careful about his metaphysics, because his metaphysics was bounded to his refusing of the Trinity doctrine and its religious beliefs. So we don't have a lot of matter to be sure or to know if his metaphysics was bigger than we can find in his texts. And I think God became a problem at the 18th century for different reasons, historical reasons, for theologian reasons, for rational reasons. And it was very simple to forget the metaphysic thesis of Newton or to put them under the carpet. Because the scientific, the physical system of Newton is working even if you forget the metaphysics and the theology he has. So I don't know where is the limit, where is the crucial point. But I can say that it is easy to make this distinction when you read Newton, because it is not a system, or it is not an explicit system, and because his interest in natural philosophy was important at an equal. Là, je me suis perdue dans ma structure. C'est aussi important que son intérêt pour la philosophie naturelle est aussi important que son intérêt pour les questions théologiques. Not sure you understand.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. It answered my question and went well beyond, but it was very, very interesting. We might come back on it later on, but now, please, Henny, go ahead with your question.
Thanks a lot. First, thank you also, Clémence, for giving us the occasion for this discussion, and I enjoyed reading the introduction and the chapter you sent. I have a lot of questions, and I noted some points also during our discussion now. Perhaps I will pick out perhaps 3 questions. Perhaps that's too much, but then you can choose to what you reply. So a first question is about the conception in De Gravitatione of space as something that emanates from God. And so in your introduction, you mentioned that this thesis causes a lot of theological problems. And I must say that I'm not yet a specialist of Newton, but I know some of the discussions on this, and I'm not sure that I really understand well why this is so problematic to conceive of space as an emanation of God. So traditionally in the discussions, scholars, they point to the problem that either space and time should have pre-existed, so that pre-existed in relation to God, but I don't see this as an option if space is an emanation of God. And then the problem seems to be that somewhere during creation, God must have created first space and time. But I think the notion of emandation is different from creation. And so I have difficulties to really see the exact nature of the theological problems that, that you mentioned. So that's the first question. A second question is, when you gave your 8 or Newton's 8 thesis, metaphysical thesis, so the 7th one was about space being existing before there are any physical bodies, and this seems to this seems to coincide or to correspond to a substantivalist account of space. So in the traditional distinction of relationist or substantivalist accounts of space. But I know that, for example, Howard Steen and Robert Tissal, they have said, no, Newton doesn't allow us to say that space is substantivalist. And that's also something that I wanted to know more about. How could you say that space must exist as something empty of bodies before there are any bodies? So it must exist somehow, but it's not substantivalist. So it's not I understand it's not a substance for that matter, but I'm not sure that substantivalist accounts must necessarily say that space is a substance. And then the third question was simply about, well, not simply, perhaps complexly, about space as something imaginary. And so there I was touched by what you said about at the end of your research, you're still wondering why people want to refer to space as something. And there you seem to say, well, it's a historical aspect of our thought. So we have been acquainted with this notion of space, considering it as something, but this corresponds to a certain era in our historical development. And I'm not sure that this is the whole truth, because I have difficulties to believe, for example, that, let's say, in 5 centuries, people will, when they think about space, they would be able to imagine something like 4-dimensional space with the same evidence as we are able to imagine 3-dimensional space. So I think there's something more than a historical compound, and it's maybe much more linked to human subjectivity than you knowledge with the standpoint of a historical era. And perhaps you know this, but John O'Keefe was a Nobel Prize winner, I think 5-6 years ago, and he's working in medicine, and he says, well, in fact, I think that Kant was right to say that space is a structure of the subject, and it precedes every perception, but it also precedes every conception of physical or geometrical space, because it's embedded in the subject. And if that's the case, then it's not just a kind of historical era where humans were thinking of space as something, or as space in a Euclidean structure. So that's the more complicated question, perhaps. But thanks a lot also for the discussion so far.
Thanks to you and for these 3 questions, very difficult. Maybe what I will say about the emanation and the difference between emanation and creation will answer to the second point at the maybe at your second question. The structure of an emanation isn't very compatible. Sorry. The structure of an emanation isn't, I think, very compatible with transcendent God, because when you think of an emanation from something, the thing that is emanated from this first thing is still linked to its cause. But Newton, the God of Newton, is a transcendent God. Of course, is present to be able to act, but is for Newton transcendent. And the emanation is, like we said before, a sort of tool to try to say the link between space and God and the world, but it isn't enough, and it is difficult. It brings difficulties, theological difficulties, because it is as if the space was a sort of distant part of God. And it is a risk to fall into the deification of space. So the emanative structure isn't very good for Newton, because that I'm not sure you understand me. He tries to use it in De Gravitatione, in Tempus et Locus. We see that he's hesitating. He made some reference to the Kabbalistic literature, where we find an emanative structure between God and the Sephira or Sephiros of God. But finally, he doesn't use it anymore, because the bridge between a transcendent God and a world, a created world, is so strong with an emanative structure. and he tries to put together two requisites, we could say, to maintain this link, because for Newton, God exists, and we needed to put some movements in the world, and to believe in him, and etc. But at the same time, God has to be for him distant from the world, and the emanative structure isn't the same thing that the creation, the concept of creation that he uses. When you consider the concept of creation, it is as if the creator and the creature are not the same entity at all. Of course, the creature exists dependently or because the creator, but you can study the creature without the creator, and you have a creator that is preserved from the materiality, the divisibility, the matter of the creature. So I noticed that the emanation was used by Newton at the beginning of his thinking, but just in the De Gravitatione explicitly, and more implicitly in Tempus et Locus. And after this manuscript, he abandoned this structure. But at the same time, space isn't created for Newton. Because if you imagine that God created space, where was God before the creation, before the fiat? And that's the point for Newton. God needs to be somewhere, even if the world doesn't exist, and before the world was created. So space and time cannot be created. In De Gravitatione, he says that space was uncreated, but it's the only one occurrence of this world. After he tries other expression and other categories of causation to think that, and he doesn't use this word uncreated anymore. So we have something that is not an emanative result from God, because it is different from God, and God is different from space. It's the more important point. And at the same time, space isn't created by God, because we need to think that space existed at the same time as God, to imagine that God was somewhere before creating. And that the big question, maybe it's more difficult for Newton than the question of the nature of space. How space could exist if it's not an emanation of God, and if it's not a creation of God. And we can find some ideas in more Henry Moore's work, when Moore said that God was like, I don't know the word, une ombre, l'ombre d'un objet, je vais sur le bout de la langue.
A shadow.
The shadow, like the shadow of God, merci, like the shadow of God. It is we do not create our shadow, and it exists at the same time we exist, but it is not a part of us. It is not an emanation of our nature. So it is at the same time something that is always here, but not a part of ourselves. And you can transpose this idea to the relationship between God and space in Newton's text. I am clear. Okay. And that's why the notion of substance isn't a good one to think space for Newton, because substance has a metaphysical density or ontological density that Newton cannot give it. This is why space isn't a substance. If you claim it is a substance, you give it an importance in terms of reality that it doesn't have.
But perhaps
yes,
that's clear
yes.
for me. But I think because of the seventh metaphysical thesis that you mentioned, space exists independently from the bodies that are filling it. I think this is just how substantivalism is now interpreted. Also, space-time substantivalism just means space-time, the structure of space-time is there, independent of any matter in the universe. And so I don't think that the fact that Newton would deny that space is a substance means that we can't say that he is a substantivalist. But of course, this is a bit of technical discussion, perhaps. But I just remembered that those two authorities on Newton, so Steen and Dissel, they had argued that Newton is not a substantivalist, he's not a relationist, he has some kind of third option. And
yes.
Because of this thesis that I don't see why he wouldn't be a substantivalist. That was my question, in fact. But you don't have to come up with an answer to that. It was just something I wondered on hearing it.
It's a good question, and of course it is a third way of thinking space and relation to the idea of substance, but at the same time maybe we could say that is a substantivalist. I should read again Stein and the others to remember their arguments. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you. And about your third question about the structure of the space as a structure of our subjectivity, could you ask me your question another time, please?
Yeah.
Just briefly.
So I just was I was struck by the way you ended your introduction. So this was, of course, opening to some kind of more philosophical debate on the notion of space, and I like that a lot. And so one of the things you said, yeah, but why do we still think of space as something, whereas science has shown that it is not a kind of thing? And so I agree with that, or with the question as such. But when you say conceiving of space as something Euclidean, three-dimensional, is a historical fact. And I think it's more than that. And I think that, I mean, even if I imagine space, it's still three-dimensional. And I know that there's the theory of general relativity, but I'm not able to have the same, let's say, the same grasp of space in general relativity as I have in Euclidean geometry. And so my point was that I'm a bit skeptic when it comes to the claim that, let's say, people would evolve to the point where they would have this same natural grasp of space as something that would be totally different from the way I imagine space. You could say from a scientific viewpoint, perhaps naively, as three-dimensional Euclidean space. But it seems that it is so strongly connected with the way human subjects need to imagine or to see space, to conceive of space, that the scientific discussion about, or the cosmological question, what is the best geometrical structure which geometrical structure corresponds best to the structure of space-time, seems another question than how are we conceiving of space naturally? And that's why I was struck by you pointing to some kind of historical era in our conception of space. Do you see the point? I think there are two different considerations.
Yes, I see. You're one of the tension of the, yes, in the place. Larvatus prodeo. They are everywhere. I'm joking.
A lot of Kantians do not accept Kant's theory of space and time, so they think this is not, can't be hold. So I'm even one of those Kantians who is kind of convinced of Kant's account of at least of space. I mean, just also, for example, when I have students and they say, yeah, but Kant is, I mean, it's passé, because, well, we know that we have Lobachevsky, we have other kinds of geometries, and Kant didn't know about that. But yes, but still, we are not, if we ask people to imagine space, or we don't have the capacity to, well, to use Kantian terminology, to construct in intuition a priori another kind of space than the Euclidean one. And I'm skeptic when people say, yeah, but perhaps humans will evolve and they will be able someday to have the same intuitive grasp of a kind of multi-dimensional space-time. I don't think it's possible.
I don't know. I cannot answer to your question, but maybe I have in some data to give you from research I did recently. But maybe it doesn't interest you, and you will say. But I ask to people what was space for them, not just out of nowhere like that. It was a sort of sociological interviews with martial artists and with dancers who dance alone, professional dancers. And we talk about their activities and their relationship to their practice, etc. And at the end, after 1 hour or 2 hours of discussion, I ask them, but what is space for you? You talk about space, but I have work on the interviews of the martial artists, not the dancer for now, but soon. And the martial artists were a little bit confused, and they have a conception of space that very different from the absolute space of Newton. They think space like an interval between bodies, between their body and the bodies around them, or the imaginary bodies when they practice without a partner. And in their conception of space, at each time you meet the idea that space is, that the conception of space is linked to an idea of rhythm, like musical rhythm, a rhythm of motions of bodies. And in function of so it was interesting for me because I was sure that space was for everyone something like the space ball. I call it previously, but for these people it was sometimes like a space ball, but in their practice of Japanese martial arts, Budo, it was an interval, a mix of space and rhythm, and distances between bodies. And I read some texts from Japanese thinkers, and the idea of a space distinct from time, distinct from bodies, distinct from motions is very strange, very weird, and maybe useless. So the difficulty is just not an historical one, but also a geographical and cultural one. And it was interesting that the martial artist I met wasn't Japanese, but they have a long practice of Budo, 30 years of practicing. This was very important in their life since a long time, and their way of thinking space was the same of the way of the Japanese thinkers I read. But it's a research not unfinished, so I don't have a lot of conclusions about it, and I have to read the interviews of the dancers I did to see if it's the same thing or not. But it's not an answer, but I think it is an important things to add to think about this way of experience and characterizing space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I'm very interested in this, and I think it's very interesting. And of course, it's well, it may be difficult for us to well, to imagine the experience of totally different cultures that have other historical processes to think about these issues. And
sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's
you're welcome. Thanks to you. It's the same difficulties that I have when I read Aristotle about natural places and places around the bodies, and it's very difficult for me, maybe for you too. I hope I'm not alone, to understand what's topos for Aristotle and why he refuses other thinking of space, which are more, that are closer to our thinking of space today. So it's the same gap between the Aristotelian thinking and ours today.
Thanks.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So it's 4 o'clock. We have perhaps one last question from Olivier. Please keep it short.
Hello, thank you a lot for your introduction and your chapter. My question is quite short, I think. It's about page 33. It's about the Newton's geometrical demonstration of the actual infinite. So you quoted Newton 2 times, and then you have 2 paragraphs where you explain those quotes. And I didn't quite understand the last sentence. So chaque point mathématique ouvre un infini qui existe actuellement. So this is the last sentence of the last paragraph of that page. So that's my first question. And my second question is related to the second sentence of that paragraph also. I was wondering if there is, because you write that there is one last intersection point between the two, between D and D prime, and that intersection is at an infinite distance. But I thought that Newton, in the quote just above, wrote that cette distance est certainement plus grande que n'importe quelle distance assignable, ou plutôt aucun de ces points n'est le dernier. So I didn't quite understand why you would say that, and then with the rest of the text. So I'm sure that I didn't understand it. So if you could explain it to me, it would be nice. Thank you.
Thanks to you, and I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I understand this either. It's the point that I focused on in my talk, the difficulty to understand the link between mathematical thinking and physical thinking. And there is another extract of De Gravitatione, which is very difficult. It is when Newton talks about the figures, geometrical figures that would exist, not just potentially, but actually in space, even if we don't see them. It is very strange. It is a sort of bridge between an Euclidean way of thinking, whereas an indefinite or an infinite number of points, and a physical thinking about a physical space. It is very difficult for me to understand this point. Just it is the most difficult point of De Gravitatione for me. So I'm not sure to understand it. What I understand is that Newton is trying to conceive physical space thanks his mathematical thinking. It is as if he put a sort of filter of the physical space, but a mathematical filter, and he says to us, you have around a lot of mathematical figures and a number of points that are infinite, and you do not see them, but there are all of these points, all of these circles, all of these lines around you, and they exist actually. And this question of the actuality of the existence of these points, of mathematical points, is truly the bigger difficulty for me in the De Gravitatione. When I did my talk, I asked you if you have some suggestions. I will take them very with a lot of pleasure, because I tried I said that it was maybe the point where we can see the beginning of the mathematical physics, of Newton, the moment where the physical level and the mathematical level are mixed, but it is not at the same time geometrical realism, and I do not understand this difficulty. I see the difficulty without any problem, but maybe you have some suggestion. What I tried to show in these two quotes you gave me of the book, it is this link, but the reasons of the existence of this link, of this way of thinking, a lot of points to demonstrate the infinity of a physical space, it is really difficult. And it's for me, it's an obscurity of De Gravitatione.
Okay, thank you very much.
You might further discuss it via email or in another context if you wish. But so I'm sorry to say that the session is now over. Thank you very much, Clémence, once again for joining us today here, and it was a very nice discussion. I just remind you that the next section of the seminar, the last of the year, will be in a month from now, so December the 4th. It's a Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. And we will host Courtney Fugate, who will discuss a paper on Kant and Newton. So anybody's welcome again, and we will share the relevant information and the texts in a few days' time. So once again, thank you very much. Et à une prochaine. Merci beaucoup.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Clémence, if I can also say for my part, thank you.